The first thing I want to say is that this is the second time in as many weeks that Miguel has told me that he was going to wear a suit. So I wore a suit. And
you're getting a microphone put on.
Now I'm getting a microphone. So now I'm not going to take it off because I wore it. No, it's okay. The division of labor actually for this talk that Miguel and I worked out for tonight has me kind of doing all the dull classroom background stuff while he gets to talk about sort of our experiences and the real exciting struggle. And I think this is actually pretty fair and reflects our respective personalities better anyway. But there are some important things that folks should know in terms of the background to the mass struggle that's erupted in Honduras. Naturally, I can't develop the whole picture of the thing, both from lack of time and from, really honestly a lack of knowledge personally. So instead, I'll merely try to indicate some of the key points of the development, and we can leave it to the discussion to see what people, want expanded or what we'd like to pursue in more detail. So the irony of the struggle in Honduras against the coup, which is, and I think people should have no doubt about this, a mass movement that has the participation and the support of the majority of the population against the people that made the coup, including the vast majority of workers, peasants, and oppressed people, despite what you might hear in the American press. The irony of this struggle is that Honduras has hitherto been considered actually one of the most stable and quiescent countries in Central America. So in the fourth edition of the very good book, Understanding Central America, which was published in 2006, Booth, Wade, and Walker write, quote, governed by the armed forces well into the 1980s, Honduras shared many of the regime characteristics of El Salvador, Guatemala, and pre-revolutionary Nicaragua. Nevertheless, unlike other authoritarian regimes, Honduras managed mostly to escape the violent upheavals of those neighboring states. And this was not because Honduras was relatively well off or doing better than its neighboring countries. Actually, it is, or at least it was, before the presidency of Manuel Zelaya. It was, by many indicators, the poorest country in Central America in terms of the division between rich and poor, the percentage of people below the poverty line, the level of the minimum wage before the Zelaya reforms, which we'll talk about, and so on. Those are many indicators. The poorest and worst off country in Central America, hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. so-called assistance notwithstanding. And this is because the tempo of capitalist development in Honduras was relatively slow until the 1990s. The term banana republic actually originally was developed to refer to Honduras. It reflected both the political arrangement, that is the big banana magnates actually controlled the political society, but also the paucity of Honduran industry, which was dominated by the non-intensive banana industry. That is, it wasn't heavy industry, it wasn't very labor intensive, but that's what dominated the country. Until roughly 30 years ago, foreign capital did not show great interest in Honduras, and native capital was typically unmotivated. So you had the banana trade, which was foreign controlled, but outside of that, not very much, and not much investment from the sort of indigenous or native capitalist class. So as recently as 1980, 63% of the economically active Hondurans were actually employed in agriculture, most of them as campesinos, as peasants, and only 16% of the gross domestic product came from manufacturing, which is actually roughly the same as in 1960. So over a whole really post-war period, not a whole lot of economic development. So although Honduras was very poor, it was also relatively lacking in the social dynamism, particularly the presence of a large urban industrial working class that produces generally mass struggle. This began to shift decisively in the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s, Central America was shaken by a series of armed struggles against authoritarian pro-US regimes, most importantly in Nicaragua, of course, where the Sandinistas overthrew the despised dictator Somoza. At this point, by sort of way of a historical inversion, the relative quiescence of Honduran politics hitherto, which had been nurtured by the relative disinterest of the major imperialist power of the U.S., became the basis for rapidly increased intervention. Which is to say, because Honduras was stable coming into the 1980s, stable in the sense of not a lot, not the kind of guerrilla movements or revolutionary movements that were affecting everywhere else in Central America. Because it was relatively stable, the U.S. actually turned it into a staging ground for its war on the Central American left regionally. Thus, from the period of 1977 to 1980, to the period 1981 to 1984, U.S. military aid to Honduras jumped 13-fold, from about $3 million in the first period to over $41 million in the second. U.S. so-called economic assistance, which sort of always has a way of following and lagging behind military aid and following its trends, U.S. economic assistance nearly tripled, and then to the next 4 years after that, into the next third period of 4 years, again more than doubled from there. So the U.S. hijacking of Honduras in the 1980s permanently disfigured the national body politic and the development of politics in the state. Southern Honduras was more or less turned over to the right-wing Nicaraguan Contras, which naturally fed the development of right-wing extremism and death squads in Honduras. So people have probably heard the name Billy Oya, who organized a number of the death squads and has now actually been rehabilitated by the Coup government. He sort of got his start in this stuff. This was when Negroponte was operating in the country, and et cetera. However, there was actually a counter-development of Honduran civil society as people actually organized to resist the repression. Many of the organizations that are now sort of active and live in Honduras today were developed in the 1980s as a response to some of the repression. For instance, COFADE, which is an organization that Miguel and I did a lot of work with while we were in the country. That organization was actually put together in the early 1980s by families of people who were disappeared by the regime. So you had a counter-development of civil society, which becomes important later on, and certainly is very involved in the resistance today. So that's some of the political changes that began to occur in the 1980s. The economic structure of the country really begins to shift decisively in the 1990s when a neoliberal economic policy was imposed on the country by the U.S., albeit with the full support of the native capitalist and oligarchic class. The urban working class rapidly expanded in the 1990s, particularly in the maquiladora, that is the sweatshop sector of the textile industry. So by 1999, you have only 13% employed in agriculture. Recall there was 63% just 20 years ago in 1980. In 1999, 32% of GDP is from manufacturing, which doubles the percentage in the economy from 20 years ago in 1980. So these economic changes were accompanied by kind of formal democratization, but with the real political power in the country remaining in the hands of the sort of 10 or 12 traditional oligarchic families who controlled both the major political parties and the civil service and state bureaucracy, had actually, through this whole process of neoliberalism, had reinforced their ties with American capital. Living standards declined under the force of several so-called structural adjustment programs. A dramatic example of the damage wrought by these policies came in 1998 with Hurricane Mitch, which killed in Honduras an astonishing 11,000 people and left 2 million people homeless after the hurricane and the floods. The hurricane had washed away the shanties of migrant workers who were crowding in the hillsides of Tegucigalpa. That is, people had left the countryside trying to find work in the main city. Perversely, while the World Bank actually made a show of loan forgiveness in the wake of Mitch, in the fine print, Honduras was actually obligated to enter into even more structural adjustment programs, including a series of failed privatizations that actually badly affected the attempts to rebuild after Mitch. So all this is to say that the struggle today against the coup actually has deep roots and deep class roots in the changes and dislocations arising from imperialist and neoliberal policies pursued by American and Honduran elites over the last really 30 years. But there's a much more I could say about that, but I actually want to fast forward a bit to the more immediate situation just before and then following the coup d'etat. Zelaya, who's popularly called Mel, so if I say Mel, that means Zelaya. Zelaya was elected in 2006 on the Liberal Party ticket, and he is himself sort of personally actually a product of the oligarchy, and his party, the Liberal Party, is itself pretty comprehensively oligarchic. In fact, the current sort of usurper president, Roberto Micheletti, is a member of the Liberal Party as well, so he's actually a member of the same party as Zelaya. That said, over the course of Zelaya's term, he attempted, and sometimes successfully, to introduce several reforms that actually broke from the neoliberal economic model and pursued a more independent path of development. These included joining the ALBA economic bloc, which is sort of the Venezuela-led alternative bloc for economic development, and raising the minimum wage 60%. So Honduras went from a country to actually, I think, the lowest minimum wage in Central America to one with one of the highest. Significantly, Zelaya also got passed a law through Congress. They now deny that they ever did this, but they did. Zelaya got passed through Congress a law allowing consultative referenda on social questions, and it was the exercise of his right to actually run such a survey under this law that triggered the coup, which is actually, which is to say actually that Zelaya, in the sort of, the sort of mythologies that Zelaya was trying to have a referendum to extend his term or whatever, which is not true. Zelaya, in fact, didn't do anything illegal or even extra legal. He was well within the rights of a law that he had initiated and the Congress had actually passed. I think it's also critical to just point out, and I don't have time to develop it, but maybe people can ask about it or talk about it. It's critical to point out that Zelaya's moves were actually taking place in a regional Latin American context where several nations, most prominently Venezuela, but also Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Argentina, and others, had made some kind of break with the Washington-led neoliberal model and were attempting to undertake a more sort of social-minded, independent form of development to varying degrees. There are all sorts of contradictions with that. I think Venezuela is sort of the more clear sort of left-wing thing, but there's definitely a context of trying to develop a different model in Latin America, which is important for the context in which the coup happens and some of its implications. So the oligarchs in Honduras did not make the coup. This probably doesn't need to be said, but just to say, did not make the coup in order to defend the Constitution. And actually, we'll get to their sort of tender and loving treatment of the Constitution soon enough. But the oligarchs made the coup in order to preserve neoliberal policy and the sort of social vampirism that they enjoyed as a result of it. So I just want to tell one of many stories, and Miguel and I could probably tell a lot more if people are interested, or maybe when we go and get a few drinks in us at the fundraiser later. But I want to tell one story to illustrate just how the rich are actually accustomed to acting in the country. So in Honduras, many people told us that the rich, simply just don't pay their electricity bills. So neither for the businesses that they own, nor for their own private homes and mansions. In fact, some of the oligarchs, some of the key rich people hadn't paid an electricity bill in over 10 years. No one actually really did anything about this for the longest time because they were rich people. So what are you gonna do about it? Until the Zelaya government actually did some accounting and realized that the state had lost between $10 and $20 million due to non-payment. Which I know in the days of AIG bailouts, that's like sort of chump change or whatever, but it's actually a huge amount of money in Honduras, and given like the level of poverty, the number of things that could be done with that money. So Zelaya was actually preparing a lawsuit against people that hadn't paid their bills in a long time, and the Congress, which is dominated by the right wing and by the oligarchs, preemptively passed a law declaring an amnesty that no one that has any electricity bills due has to pay them. So I think it's just like a sort of taste of the arrogance of the Honduran ruling class and why they got behind the coup. So the coup makers and their supporters in the U.S. claim that Zelaya was in violation of Article 239 of the Honduran Constitution. Article 239 states that, and incidentally, I don't know if people read there was a Projo column about this yesterday, which was quite bad and stupid. But to go through it, Article 239 states that the president cannot run for re-election, and that anyone who even proposes to change Article 239 is immediately divested from office. And I think it's really an absurd article in many ways. First, it's a piece of legislation that declares itself immutable, that it can't be changed ever, which is obviously incompatible with the idea of democracy. And several Honduran lawyers actually pointed this out to us. You can't make a law and then declare it never can be changed. It's anti-democratic. People have to be able to change the laws, including the Constitution. Second, it makes it a crime to merely propose, that is to say something. So if you just say, I think we should reform this, and if you're any kind of official, you're immediately divested from office. Third, it actually contradicts previous articles in the Honduran Constitution that actually lay out, here's the process to impeach someone, to remove someone from office. There's a process for doing that. This article then says if you merely say something, you're immediately terminated from office. So it may in fact be the most illogical piece of constitutional law ever devised. And people should know this was actually only inserted into the Honduran Constitution in 2003. So it's not like this is something that existed for 100 years in the Honduran Constitution, part of the tradition. It was inserted by the Congress in 2003. But leaving even if you accept all that or even just leave it all to one side, Zelaya actually did not propose to alter Article 239. He merely asked to conduct a non-binding survey on whether there should be a vote in November on whether to convoke a constituent assembly to examine and reform the Constitution. So regardless of how that survey actually turned out, Zelaya couldn't have run for re-election in November. And he said this many times. It kind of doesn't penetrate into the minds of our beloved right-wingers. But Zelaya couldn't have run for re-election in November, no matter which way that survey had panned out. So really, I mean, I think all the sort of right-wing or golpista charges against Zelaya are really a tissue of lies. Not only that, but I think it's important to point out that it's the coup makers themselves who have repeatedly and gratuitously actually violated the law and the Constitution. Article 3 of the Honduran Constitution makes it clear that governments installed by the armed force are illegitimate, and actually rather grandly states that people have the right to insurrection against a coup government. The current Liberal Party candidate for the president, Elvin Santos, is barred from running because he was the vice president. And in order to run, he actually resigned his office. But under the Honduran Constitution, the office can't be renounced. He can't actually resign from the office. Of course, none of the oligarchs seem to actually care about this because he's rich. He owns a couple of the really big malls in Tegucigalpa, and therefore he can do as he likes. So he's an open violation of the Constitution. There's no reason he should be allowed to run, but it's considered okay, and his big campaign posters are all up around the city, and no one says anything about it. So the democratic movement, the resistance movement, is demanding a constituent assembly in no small part because the elites have made such a joke of the Constitution, either through their illogical amendments to it or just by openly flouting it anytime it becomes inconvenient. So ordinary people really feel they need a new start with an inclusive process to rewrite the document as a basis for the law. So I want to then now just conclude by saying something briefly about the role of the United States in all this, which I think is really critical and important to understand. And I hope it actually comes out in discussion, we develop it more. Because I think really as sort of greedy and vile as the Honduran rich are, we should realize that the majority of the profits are not actually kept by them, but flow north to Big Brother. Fruit of the Loom, Burger King, Coke and Pepsi, Dunkin' Donuts. These are the corporate names that actually dominate the skyline of Tegucigalpa, and usually not even translated. You go Popeye's chicken, and there's a Spanish word for chicken, but it's just all the American signs, all the American corporations. So that's where the money really goes. I think everyone in Honduras actually knows perfectly well that the U.S. backs the coup and is backing the coup, and they could have never have happened without a green light from high-placed people in the U.S. government. I think the Honduran people, from conversations we've had, do find the whole stance of Obama a little puzzling. I think we find Obama a little puzzling generally, but I think they're generally pretty far also from being taken in by what they called Obama's two-facedness or the double game that he's playing. So in my view, I think the strategy of the U.S. was, at least, to formally condemn the coup, while in practice giving it time to consolidate its power, which is why the U.S. never did the basic things that you should, that is part of actually the automatic stuff you do if you declare formally a coup d'etat. Things like cutting off the aid, freezing bank accounts for the coup makers, and refusing visas for the coup maker sort of traditional pilgrimages to Miami, and so forth. So I think the plan was to allow the coup to consolidate, and after a discrete period, the U.S. would then use the sort of phony compromise negotiations, which are being peddled by their client, Costa Rican President Arias, to formalize the defeat of Zelaya. They may actually let him go back into the country, but only by agreeing don't have the constituent assembly, don't be in charge of the armed forces, be essentially a caretaker president, possibly even move up the elections, and so on and so forth. So essentially to actually impose a defeat on Zelaya and the popular movement, to take away their program, and to consolidate the rule of the oligarchs once more. However, the continuous mobilization of the Honduran resistance, which is now, I think, in its 52nd consecutive day, and by consecutive, I mean really, there are mobilizations and meetings and marches every single day, which Miguel will probably talk about more. But this continuous mobilization actually wrecked the plan of the U.S. because it prevented the coup regime from ever stabilizing the situation. The coup still rules by acts of mass repression. That's the only way it keeps power in the country. It doesn't command any loyalty, even the sort of passive, I guess, whatever, we'll put up with it. People hate it. They don't have any confidence, and the only way they're keeping power is through the guns of the police and the armed forces. So this is really the kind of movement in Honduras which has stopped the U.S., which has just seemed like the unstoppable beast, in its tracks, and is currently defending, I think, all the progress that's been made for independent development and democracy and a more social mode of life in Latin America. You know, all that progress that's been made over the last several years, and sort of the character of the resistance and what it means and what our experience with where I think is some of the stuff that Miguel is going to touch on more. So.
Couple of friends from Boston. They are part of the Honduras resistance. Si pueden parar un momentico para que los reconozcan. Tito, compañera. These are two compañeros from Boston. I have traveled actually to Boston, you know, way back there, way in Boston, to some of the events that they have had. And also with us is a very good friend who is a consul general from Venezuela, the camera over here, Omar Sierra. Yeah, Omar and I have developed good relationship way back when he was in New York, and has been involved a lot in the community and the things that has been happening also in the United States at community level. So not only as a diplomat in relationships. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Honduras, well, I want to talk to you about two things. One is the bad things and the good things. And I think I'm going to start with the good things. The good thing is that before this coup, the people haven't really, they haven't clicked in their mind the struggle and the fight. Before, you know, they knew about the corrupt. They have known about the corruption and everything, but they have been like kind of laid back on that until the coup happened, and then it was like the spark, and that spark just spread out, like, you know. And today is like, was it 51 days already? 51 days of a struggle, and it's every single day they come out in march. They are always out there marching, 3,000–4,000 people. And when the police come and repress them, then the following day is like 7–10,000 people that comes out. And it has been like that. It's like every day, every time the police does their thing, they come out in bigger numbers and bigger numbers. Last one that we went was like around, what, 100,000 people? I mean, it was huge. So, and that has created a movement that is fascinating to me in terms of the struggle, because I had an opportunity to interview the indigenous people, the leader of the indigenous people there, a couple of members of the Garáfonas, which is the blacks from Honduras, the Villa Campesino, the leader of the Villa Campesino, who is also part of that struggle, and they all have basically come together, and also the unions, especially one that's called Stevie's, which is that to do with beverage and similarities, and it's very also strong there. And I interviewed them individually, and they all kind of say the same. And I realized that this whole thing about the referendum, it wasn't Zelaya idea, but it came from the people. Like, you know, we have no representation. We don't have a voice. We are not recognized. And the struggle that they all have with the land, privatization of the land, the water, you know, the rivers, all the kind of the stuff that's going on there. So for the first time since the independence of Honduras, they the Garáfonas, which is the black community there, were able to actually go into the presidential palace, which they had never done before, and the other also the indigenous people. So Celaya was like kind of receiving everybody there. That's part of the good things that been happening. Is this merge, and also one thing that I found fascinating is to hear indigenous people saying that they are fighting for everybody, including gays and lesbians. You know, it's like we are all in this together. And in the protest, the gays and lesbian transvestites, they all also will come out in support of the resistance against the coup. So it's really fascinating how in Honduras, even we can say that it's a country that is backward, it's a banana republic, how they are even better than us here, especially in Rhode Island, where we have a legislation that is all basically they are all Democrats and cannot even recognize the gays and lesbian marriage and the equality. You know, the struggle that here people have been going on for 13 years. So I found it fascinating. One of the people that I interviewed was Maria Luisa Burjas. She's an ex-colonel of the police. She was forced to retire after she issued an order to arrest 2 other colonels for corruption. So and since we got there, we've been hearing about up in the mountains there have been people who has been killed when they were crossing the border to Nicaragua, and people have mentioned it to us that they were that in their way back, people tumbled found some bodies on the mountains, and over there what they do is they don't use guns, they use the knife, so that way they cannot, the bullets cannot be traced. So they basically starve to death people, and sometimes people exaggerate, and so I was like kind of believing it or not. But when we spoke with Maria Luisa, she told us that she's got phone calls from other cameras in the police saying that this is happening. They are, while people are talking about 10, the death is around 10. People dead, but there's more than that, and they're all kind of missing. This experience with her was really interesting because she's running for Congress now, and she's proposing to disband the whole army, that the army should be disbanded, professionalize the police. She thinks that there's no need to have an army in Honduras, just like in Costa Rica, and she said, you can professionalize this whole police, and you don't need anything else. And actually, you should get rid of the police too, and start from the beginning. She mentioned that in papers there is 12,000 soldiers in the Honduras army, but actually there's only 7,000. So the other 5,000, they are on the payroll, and those checks comes to the colonels and the generals, and because those people don't really exist, they just kept those checks. So there's a lot of corruption at all levels in Honduras. I found the people, the resistance, to be like an amazing group of people. The only complaint that I have is that, Jesus, they walk like 10, 15 miles every. I'm gonna tell. I was at one point. I told them, it's like, could you please stop walking give us a break. It's like, what? We only been walking for 45 days, and this is just the beginning. I'm like, what? but they really, I mean, they, you know, and it's funny. Shaun and I were talking about, it's like Jesus, and we marched from Broad Street to the State House, to the Capitol, right? And we are all whining and complaining, and they walk like, 10, 15 miles like nothing, like really, like, it's amazing. Just to think about it makes me sweat. Because so I did a lot of walking there with accompanying the march. One of the things that there is of course there is people who are getting infiltrated on the march, and they are doing this, and they are breaking the law, disturbances and stuff like that. One of the on Tuesday, that we were in Juan Pablo or something, that boulevard. We were on one of the main boulevard, and the march, the people that were marching, some of them came out and started breaking the windows of the Burger King and Pizza Hut, I think, and some of the people that were like the marshals around it trying to stop them, and they couldn't. So what naturally is, it was very interesting to see it, because I was just looking at them. The marchers start moving away from this thing that was happening, and just the people who were the troublemakers were by themselves, So the following day, we were reading that like 11 people got arrested for breaking of the windows, and it's like, those were not the people. They had nothing to do with this. So we saw a lot of also human rights violation. What I found it very emotional was Wednesday, when the police actually what's happening at that time was that the marches were going up the street to Congress, and the police was there waiting. But what we didn't know is that like 3 or 4 blocks away, there was like 300 or 400 soldiers and police that were coming behind us, and we didn't notice. And they did attack the crowd. That was it was a very pacifist, and there was one of the congressmen who got hurt. Actually, he didn't get hurt. He got beat up by the cop. And basically, what the cop was saying is that there were like 20 or 30 cops that jumped on him. It's one of the interview that we did, and basically what he was saying is, this guy is a congressman. Let's beat them up harder than anybody else. And they broke his arm like a few times. The same thing happened also to a presidential candidate, and it was the same situation where his arm was broken in a few places, and it was strange. Like it's like there is a technique to do that, and then. I was reading that in the internet that Micheletti, or Gorilete, like they say over there, has hired a team from Israel that is training the troops on crowd control kind of things, So that is that also was very disturbing. I have to say that I'm 51 years old, and I never seen what I saw in Honduras. The Congress be turned into a detention center. That is unheard of, And while people were laying down on the floor that were arrested, I was able to witness then the police kicking them, and it was very disturbing and emotional actually to see that, especially how they were treating 14 years old, 15 years old kids that have nothing to do with with anything. Some of them were just watching. And when it comes to beating up people and talking about equal opportunity, they beat up the indigenous, the blacks, the architects, the doctors, professors. Everybody gets beat up over there. So it's as I say, it was really emotional. And I at one point I just look at the soldiers and I told them, it's like, it's like, I'm from the U.S. and I'm gonna tell you something. These things hurt. It's painful. It's like what you guys are doing is really painful. And one thing that I noticed there is that none of them were looking at. There were like 10 of us that went as an international observer, and none of the soldiers were looking at us. They were all had their head down or their eyes looking down. They were not even wanted to make eye contact with us because they knew that what they were doing it was wrong. And for what what I've been hearing, it looks like there is, especially in the police department, there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and among the young officers, there are different reasons why. One is because the whole coup, they know that is all made up. We also we interviewed 3 lawyers from the Attorney General's office, right? Who sat down with us and basically told us right straight out, it's like, this is a coup. It doesn't matter how you turn it around. This is a coup, and there was and Zelaya did not violate the Constitution. He didn't even think about violating the Constitution. This whole thing is made up, and for the reason that Shaun have already expressed, that how these 10 families who control, and actually out of the 11 or 14 families, 10 of them helped to basically with the coup. I want to read it to you. I want to read the names of those families. Is Jaime Rosenthal, Gilberto Goldstein, which is from the bank, Jose Rafael Ferrari, Juan Kanawati. See, we have Kanawatis in Dominican Republic too. Camilo Atala, Jose Lamas, Freddy Nasser, Jacobo Catan, Guillermo Liebman, and Rafael Flores. And among them was the magnate Miguel Facuse, which was condecorated by the Colombian Senate in 2004. And he owns a lot of like palm oil industry, and he buys the land, the peasant land, for less than 10% of their actual value. So those are the things, and I only make one copy, but I have here the list of like everything that they own over there, in terms of the newspapers, the TVs, all kind of stuff. So I will leave it for you to look at it. So those are the the things that I wanted to talk to.
estrella de pálido azul, en tu extrema que